the Ukrainian army shattered Russian leader Vladimir Putin's final hope. The supply of munitions, which had been scheduled weeks before, came to a halt with the Ukrainian army operation. The Ukrainian army successfully destroyed the train laden with weaponry and ammunition supplied by Russian commander Valery Gerasimov. While the entire world awaits the resolution of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the ferocity of the battle grows by the day. The Russian army, which rapidly renewed its control of Ukrainian land in the early months of the conflict, no longer has the same power. The Russian army still controls 4 of Ukraine's most vital regions. However, due to recent military actions by the Ukrainian army, occupying forces were forced to retreat from several of these districts. The Russian army, which continues to control the Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk, and Kherson areas, has begun to shift from an offensive to a defensive posture. The Russian army's collection of long-range missile and air defense weapons made it easy to occupy these territories. In the early months of the conflict, the Russian army possessed far more advanced and technical weaponry than the Ukrainian army. As a result, it was able to conduct airstrikes on several places within Ukraine's borders. However, during the second month of the war, owing to the military assistance offered by the United States and Western nations, the Ukrainian army has begun to respond to these attacks. Ukraine is now enjoying a significant edge thanks to the Patriot air defense systems delivered by the United States. The Ukrainian army, which has regained control of Ukrainian airspace, is conducting combat operations in the Donetsk area, attempting to dislodge occupying forces from this location. As the Ukrainian army continues its operations against the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar, both of which are located within Donetsk's boundaries, internal unrest in the Russian army has become a hot issue throughout the world. As is well known, certain issues erupted in the Russian military when the US and Western nations placed sanctions on Russia, and Putin spent a substantial portion of the money in the public treasury. Russian forces, who had no problems with guns and ammunition in the early months of the war, have now begun to face significant challenges in this area. In recent months, the Vasilivka area of Zaporizhzhia has had a serious ammunition problem. These soldiers, who are tasked to defend the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power facility, have been stationed in this area for several months. However, months later, the Ukrainian army decided to step up military operations against Zaporizhzhia. However, Russian forces stationed in the Vasilivka region began to pose issues since they lacked the necessary weaponry and ammunition to respond to the Ukrainian army's strikes. The troops of the Russian 47th Rifle Brigade unit stationed in Vasilivka sought to protest the government by causing a disturbance within the headquarters. Hundreds of Russian military personnel, joined by their superiors, published a video picture. In this video, Russian troops stated that they were having weapon and ammo shortages, and requested that military assistance be rushed to the headquarters. With the release of this footage on social media channels, the Russian General Staff ordered the immediate planning of a military dispatch to the region. Thus, a short-term catastrophe in the region was avoided. However, this isn't the first riot to occur. In the early months of the war, Russian President Vladimir Putin had enough economic power to cover the needs of the Russian forces stationed on Ukrainian land. However, according to sources close to the Kremlin, military shipments to Russian forces have been curtailed by half. According to reports, Russian forces stationed in the Donetsk city of Bakhmut are running low on guns and ammo. However, because the town of Bakhmut is one of the most intensive and violent locations of the conflict, the General Staff authorized a military cargo to this region as quickly as possible. The Kremlin administration intended to arrange for a military cargo to the region in order to resolve the weaponry and ammunition situation in Bakhmut as soon as possible. Because the Ukrainian army was heavily involved in operations against Bakhmut, these weapons should have arrived as soon as possible in the region. For this reason, the commander of the General Staff of the Rusuya, Valery Gerasimov, requested that the military supply to Bakhmut be made via rail. The Russian generals operating in the Russian armed forces accepted the proposal and approved the transfer via rail. As a result, the supply train bound for Bakhmut city would arrive in the region as quickly as possible. The Russian military forces have prepared a freight train to be dispatched to Bakhmut from the town of Glubokyi, which is located on Russia's border with Ukraine. The train would depart from Glubokyi and go to Luhansk before arriving in Donetsk. When these bombs reached Donetsk's boundaries, they would be moved to the Bakhmut area by Russian armored vehicles. However, the Ukrainian intelligence service learned of Russia's intended military supply, thwarting all of Vladimir Putin's objectives. Following the Russian army's occupation of Luhansk, tens of thousands of Ukrainian people residing in the region were compelled to relocate to Russia. Ukrainian people compelled to reside within Russia's borders and granted Russian passports have been residing in Russian border towns since the war began. However, this position has offered a significant advantage to the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian nationals residing in Russian border towns have notified Ukrainian authorities that there is a movement in the town of Glubokyi and that a new weapons cargo to Ukraine would arrive by rail shortly. Some Ukrainian citizens in the region serve the army as informants. After learning of this, the Ukrainian intelligence service convened a conference at the Ukrainian General Staff headquarters. Ukrainian General Valery Zaluzhny decided to launch a military action to prevent these weapons and ammunition from reaching Bakhmut. The mission was to be carried out by the Azov Battalion, a Ukrainian special forces organization. Azov Tabru warriors organized a special unit of 120 persons with the mission of attacking the Russian freight train. The Azov Union, which had mobilized from the Donetsk city of Lyman, intended to fully demolish the rails connecting the Luhansk area to the Donetsk boundaries. However, they quickly decided to demolish the track and train, allowing just the Russian freight train to get through. The Ukrainian Union, which mobilized from Lyman, arrived at the railway location within hours. Azov forces reached the region's woodland area and began waiting for the train, having set plastic explosives on a 500-meter portion of the track. After hours of waiting, the Russian freight train finally appeared. The freight train, which continued to move quickly, was approaching the rails where the explosives were discovered. The Russian troops who were waiting inside the train, uninformed of everything, had no idea what would happen. The freight train arrived at the location of the explosives in minutes, and the promised moment had arrived. Azov fighters hidden in the woodland area detonated the bombs via remote control. When the explosives became active on the Russian freight train, there was a massive explosion. The wagons of the train were entirely dislodged from the track and strewn across the road. As they attempted to exit the raked train carriages, the Russian soldiers were still in shock by the occurrence. However, right at this point, the Azov Battalion's men intercepted Russian soldiers attempting to exit the wagons in the crossfire. 71 Russian troops tasked to secure the train load were killed as part of the Ukrainian army's assault. This successful operation by the Ukrainian army made international headlines. The ammo train, which was supposed to be deployed to the Bakhmut front, was destroyed before it even reached the Bakhmut border. After blowing up the train, Azov Battalion men hurriedly left the area. However, the fact that this train did not reach Bakhmut would have caused even worse complications. Russian commander Valery Gerasimov believed that these guns and ammunition might reach Bakhmut more quickly by rail. Gerasimov's objectives, however, have been thwarted since a portion of the Donetsk area is still under Ukrainian military control. The Bakhmut area is extremely important for both sides. Bakhmut, which is located in a strategically significant location, is referred to as the heart of Donetsk. So the Russian government believes that whomever owns the city of Bakhmut will own the whole Donetsk area. As a result, the Russian army made significant efforts to capture the Bakhmut region for several months. Russia is unable to intervene as authority over the Bakhmut area is on the verge of being lost. The inability to deploy the weapons and ammunition given by Russia is a big issue for Russian soldiers stationed in the region. While the Ukrainian army is escalating its operations on the Bakhmut front on a daily basis, the Russian army's unwillingness to respond to these strikes poses a significant challenge to the Russia. Bakhmut is one of Putin's most desired places due to its abundance of subsurface resources. However, Gerasimov's unsuccessful cargo plan exacerbated relations between Vladimir Putin and General Gerasimov. The fact that Vladimir Putin and the chairman of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, committed such a mistake out of sight infuriated Russian generals working in the Russian armed services. These generals, who have fought valiantly to win the war on Ukrainian territory for months, have no strength left to endure such a defeat. Russian General Valery Gerasimov has already failed on Ukrainian soil. In the early months of the battle, the Ukrainian army destroyed an ammunition train traveling from Crimea to the Kherson area. Despite its weakness, the Ukrainian army was able to destroy the Russian ammo train. The guns and ammunition brought from Crimea were to be sent first to Kherson, then to Melitopol. However, the Russian munitions train was destroyed by the Ukrainian army only 2 hours after leaving the Kherson area. This episode, which occurred at the time, generated a lot of uncertainty within the Russian soldiers. The repeat of such an episode has prompted Russian army generals to sharply criticize Putin and Gerasimov. Now Vladimir Putin may face a major challenge since he is unable to deploy these weapon shipments to the Bakhmut front. Russian soldiers who have been fighting for weeks with missing weapons and ammo are straining under the war's tough conditions. One of the most concerning issues for Russian President Vladimir Putin is the possibility of military misunderstanding. Putin, who understands that if this happens, he would lose the fight on Ukrainian land, is doing everything he can to prevent it. However, days later, Vladimir Putin realized he was terrified. Russian soldiers stationed on the Bakhmut front have waited weeks for the authorities to deliver them guns and ammo. The Ukrainian army, on the other side, carried out 3 separate ground operations against the Bakhmut front at this time. At the same time, the Ukrainian army is using long-range missiles to launch airstrikes on Russian headquarters in the city of Bakhmut. In response to the lack of both ammunition and air defense systems in the region, the Russian soldiers' patience ran out, sparking a significant uprising in Kararaga. The Russian government said that they would coordinate a military supply for the Russian headquarters on the Bakhmut front, but this shipment did not occur. The weaponry and ammunition intended for Russian forces stationed in the region did not arrive because the Ukrainian army damaged the train. Russian soldiers, on the other hand, began to respond, claiming that despite being promised weeks previously, no military shipments had arrived in the region. Russian soldiers, who began to believe that Vladimir Putin did not appreciate them and had begun the war for his personal gain, rioted within the headquarters. The Russian troops, who began to reject their unit commanders' instructions, eventually chose to lay down their guns and organize demonstrations within the headquarters. According to information acquired from regional sources, Russian servicemen no longer wish to remain on Ukrainian soil. These men, who have been fighting on Ukrainian soil for 2 years, are no longer able to handle the harsh conditions of the conflict. These troops, who are in critical psychiatric state, want to return to Russia, but Putin stops it. As is well known, hundreds of Russian soldiers who fought on Ukrainian soil in the early months of the conflict abandoned the battlefield and returned to Russia. Some went to Ukraine's neighboring nations and filed for refuge. However, Vladimir Putin has enacted draconian restrictions to prohibit servicemen who served in Ukraine from returning to Russia. According to these rules, any Russian soldier who abandons the front lines or seeks to flee will face a jail sentence ranging from 5 to 10 years. Russian officers and commanders who have left the front will be dismissed from the army and condemned to 20 years in jail. Vladimir Putin's draconian regulations have stranded Russian forces on Ukrainian land. However, Once the events in Bakhmut became global news, the Russian people began an uprising against Putin. According to reports, Russian President Vladimir Putin chose to partially mobilize since he couldn't locate troops to fight on Ukrainian soil. Prior to this partial mobilization decision, stalls were set up in numerous Russian cities for the voluntary recruitment of soldiers. At the same time, the Russian Ministry of Defense opened voluntary army recruiting on its website. However, Russian public reacted negatively to the voluntary enlistment of military. Russians who did not want to die for Vladimir Putin chose to flee Russia rather than fight in the army. When Russian President Vladimir Putin was unable to locate men to fight in the army, he was obliged to declare a partial mobilization. This partial mobilization decision was among Vladimir Putin's worst. Along with the mobilization decision, almost 300,000 Russian citizens were forcefully enlisted into the army and deployed to fight on Ukrainian territory. 300,000 Russian people had only a few weeks of military training before being rapidly sent to Ukrainian land. The front. Many war specialists have cautioned Vladimir Putin about this. War analysts and army generals claim that sending these newly recruited and inexperienced soldiers to Ukraine was a huge mistake. Putin has been repeatedly warned that these soldiers will cause more harm than good to the army. Despite all of these warnings, the Russian commander proceeded to include troops in the army, heading in his own course. This is one of the reasons why the Russian army has sustained so many losses on Ukrainian soil. Russian leaders have forced these novice soldiers to battle on the front lines. The Russian troops who mutinied at the Russian headquarters in Bakhmut were also included in the army as a result of the decision to partially mobilize. Following the insurrection in Bakhmut, circumstances in Russia grew significantly more problematic. Popular uprisings erupted in Russia's autonomous areas, such as Dagestan, Tatarstan, and Yakutia. This insurrection, which began with the families of soldiers who were enlisted in the army as a result of the decision to partially mobilize, quickly grew to encompass thousands of people. For many years, Russian President Vladimir Putin has pursued a restrictive stance against minorities residing in independent republics. Minority residents, dissatisfied of the government's restrictive practices, decided to organize anti-Putin and anti-war rallies. However, the underlying cause for these demonstrations is that the great majority of the civilians enlisted in the army by Vladimir Putin's mobilization order are minorities. As is well known, over 200,000 of the 300,000 Russian nationals serving in the army were chosen from minority residents residing in independent republics. The fact that the protests drew so many people in such a short period of time made Vladimir Putin extremely concerned. Putin, who does not want his reputation to suffer as a result of the impending presidential elections, has mobilized Russian security forces to suppress these rallies. Russian security forces responded to Putin's directives in the provinces of Dagestan and Tatarstan, where protests were most fierce. These demonstrators, who numbered hundreds in the morning, had grown to tens of thousands of participants within hours. The demonstrators who wanted to be caught because they were carrying anti-Putin and anti-war signs defied Russian security officers. The Russian police had a difficult time stopping the protests in the region. In addition, Russian President Vladimir Putin had to send Russian National Guard personnel to the Dagestan region, as is customary. On Vladimir Putin's instructions, Russian National Guard commander Viktor Zolotov was dispatched to the Dagestan area, along with 2,000 National Guardsmen under his leadership. The National Guard personnel ordered to the Dagestan area by Kremlin directive arrived within hours. The National Guard, which has previously successfully blocked several protests within Russia's borders, has extensive expertise in this area. As soon as they arrived, the National Guard erected a roadblock around the demonstrators and quickly barred all street entrances and exits. The National Guard intervened within an hour to successfully halt the protests, which Russian security services had been unable to prevent for hours. However, Because they had complete power, Russian National Guard soldiers acted aggressively toward minority residents. During the protests, about 300 minority persons were imprisoned. However, this episode has resulted in a far larger problem. For the first time, both the Russian people and Russian military stationed in Ukraine staged an insurrection. Although the Kremlin government effectively suppressed protests in Russia, the same cannot be said for what occurred on Ukrainian land. While the Russian soldiers stationed on the Bakhmut front began to put down their arms, the Russian 57th Rifle Brigade made an intriguing maneuver. Russian soldiers, who had been under siege by the Ukrainian army for weeks, owing to a shortage of weapons and ammunition, opted to surrender as a final choice. To live, the Russian troops preferred to surrender to the Ukrainian army rather than leave the headquarters and go to Russia, where they would face imprisonment. More than 700 Russian soldiers from the 57th Rifle Brigade deserted their headquarters and surrendered to the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers who went to the Ukrainian army. Russian soldiers who went to the town of Andrivka, which is controlled by the Ukrainian army, surrendered to them while holding white flags. The surrendering Russian troops are aware that they would be sent to Russia under the prisoner swap arrangement. Russian troops detained in Ukraine are sent to Russia every month as part of a prisoner swap arrangement. In the same way, he delivers Ukrainian troops detained in Russia. The Russian servicemen who were brought up to Russia as part of the prisoner swap arrangement will not be sent back to the front lines. For this reason, Russian soldiers choose to surrender to the Ukrainian army, believing that it is a good idea. But the really intriguing part started after that. Just before the Russian army entered Ukrainian land, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu issued declarations. Vladimir Putin has vowed that the invasion of Ukrainian land will last only a few weeks and that no Russian troops will be injured. Similarly, Military Minister Sergei Shoigu declared that they will conquer Kiev in 3 weeks and transform Ukraine into Russian territory. However, the second year of the conflict is coming to a conclusion, and over 300,000 Russian troops have died on Ukrainian land. 300,000 Russian soldiers were killed during a 2-year period, which is a significant figure. Following these recent incidents, generals in the Russian armed services began to believe that Vladimir Putin could not effectively handle the war process. According to sources close to the Kremlin, several army generals are working together to bring down the Putin administration and return Russia to its previous state. According to Sergei Naryshkin, the chief of Russia's intelligence service, certain generals in the Russian army are preparing for another coup. Wagner's commander, Yevgeny Prigozhin, had already attempted a coup in Russia. However, the coup failed, and 2 months later, Wagner commander Yevgeny Prigozhin died. As a result, it appears that the Russian generals are attempting to keep the coup as quiet as possible. However, once Sergei Naryshkin alerted Vladimir Putin about this, Putin proceeded to make some really intriguing decisions. Vladimir Putin's latest order restricted the capabilities of Russian generals serving in the army. As is well known, Russian soldiers stationed in Ukraine are commanded by several generals. Each general has his own unit. Vladimir Putin stopped these forces from being directed by these generals, ensuring that all commands were issued by a single individual. That name is Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff and a personal friend of Vladimir Putin. Russian generals must now speak with Valery Gerasimov before issuing direct instructions to their own forces. Vladimir Putin's recent paranoid behavior is mostly because of the upcoming Russian presidential elections. Vladimir Putin, who won the previous elections by a significant majority, will face a challenging election this year. Because of the conflict, the Russian people's faith in Putin has plummeted. When we look at surveys performed by independent polling agencies in Russia, it appears that Vladimir Putin has lost a significant number of votes. Based on the most recent electoral polls, sent in major cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, Putin appears to have lost more than 20s of the vote. Vladimir Putin earned the most votes in all of the Moscow and St. Petersburg elections. He was purchasing it from Petersburg. However, the fact that even in these cities 20% of the vote was lost indicates that the situation in other places is similar. The conflict was not the sole factor for Russian President Vladimir Putin's significant loss of votes. Putin, who has been president for several years, now controls the courts, the media, and law enforcement organizations. Putin is pursuing a totalitarian approach and imposing a harsh regime on his own people. Putin, who even barred independent news organizations from operating in Russia after the conflict began, is quite effective at deceiving the Russian people. Following the outbreak of war, national networks operating within Russia's borders were fully prohibited from reporting on the conflict and anti-government sentiments. While television networks that broadcast anti-war news were fined heavily, news anchors were also prosecuted and sentenced to prison. The Russian people began to grant access to international news websites in order to learn more about the continuing war in Ukraine. However, Putin stopped this after a while. Beginning in the second month of the battle, access to Russian language news websites was restricted. Over 200,000 foreign websites have been blocked, and Russian nationals are unable to access these news sites. However, the Russian people have begun to show their dissatisfaction with the situation. Despite Putin's attempts to terrify his own people with oppressive and harsh tactics, there have been several protests in Russia recently. The Russian economy has entered a tumultuous phase as a result of the conflict, and inflation rates have begun to rise, testing the patience of the Russian people. We'll all watch what happens in the presidential elections next April. When two countries are geographically near, some places become very important on the strategic battlefield. Usually, these spots are right on or near the country's boundaries, when its destiny is being decided. Donald Scanlon's plan to invade Ukraine has been the center of attention for the Russian military. Consequently, Bakhmutana's Koblaz is undeniably one of the most pivotal spots in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Knowing how the war between Russia and Ukraine came to be is essential to making sense of the situation now. There is a persistent upward tendency in backward conflicts caused by this. Since the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine, one of our ongoing hostilities has been simmering away in the background. By June, the attack on the Ukrainian army by the aggressors from Russia had spiraled out of control. Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, was reluctant to abandon the strategically significant city of Bakhmut because he could not muster the necessary forces to fight beside him. After Putin's June mobilization order failed to address the underlying problem, he engaged the Wagner Group, a private military agency, to disseminate negative reports. The diagnostic team couldn't have stood a chance against the formidable Ukrainian army. From June to now, the Wagner Group has lost tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. Putin clearly made an irrational choice, as this proves. The Wagner Group's minimum sentencing requirement is 6 months, and this verdict allows for the release of inmates who have served that minimum. Because the Russian invaders and saboteurs were helpless against the steadily increasing power of the Ukrainian army, the move likewise failed admirably. It was placed as a move after an effort to place. The Ukrainian army had targeted strategic locations in Badmouth the day prior in an attempt to alter the war's trajectory. The Ukrainian army destroyed the bridges the invading Russians were using to transport soldiers and weapons and severed their supply lines by detonating explosives. This new development is quite important, so let's discuss it. The Ukrainian army launched a barrage of attacks that finally drove the Russian invaders back, thanks to Batman's presence. Nearly everyone in the city, including the Russian invaders, had to flee for their lives. By combining air and ground assaults, the Ukrainian army successfully captured a large portion of the Bakhmut region. Even though it has only just started, The Ukrainian army's massive operation in the forests has already covered a large region. Russian President Vladimir Putin put an end to aspirations of expanding Russian territory into Ukraine. Through the rural region, the UK Ministry of Defense provided a rundown of the events on its social media channels. This is how it's done. The rearmost river is now a danger to the front line as it flows rearward through the middle of the city. The Ukrainian troops, who are presently in control of the western part of the city, have demolished a 200-meter-long, 800-meter wide open space and many important bridges spanning the north-south river. What strongholds were the Ukrainian forces using to launch their artillery into the expansive landscape? This region has turned into a battle zone, making it very difficult for Wagner's forces to attempt to resume their frontal attacks into the west. A wild slaughter ground. Bakhmut has been turned into by the Russian invaders. The demolition of the bridges over the Wilderness River has effectively cut off the invading Russian soldiers' ability to cross the city to the east. After the bridges are destroyed, the Ukrainian army will probably launch an esophageal attack. After the conference, the heads of the Ukrainian land forces, Colonel General Alexander Syrsky and General Valery Zaluzhny, made remarks about how the Ukrainian military still holds on to its heritage and toughness. The meeting was only recently organized by the Ukrainian High Command. The decision was reached to extend the presence of the Ukrainian army on this terrain and to continue both forward and backward operations. Other naysayers hold the view that it is futile to allocate combat resources to the almost leveled metropolis. There would be no benefit to either side if they took it, they claim. The defeat of the insurgents will allow Russia to advance farther east. The destruction of bridges, supply lines, and the backward area dealt a severe blow to Russian President Vladimir Putin, according to authorities in the rebel stronghold of Mariupol in eastern Ukraine. The reason this occurred was because Putin had plans to invade and seize Ukrainian land. Taking this into account, the loss of roughly 200,000 Russian men in Bakhmut was mostly due to months of fruitless fighting. Nearly every member of the Wagner Group was either dead or injured. In fact, American authorities estimated that 30,000 Wagner Group men had died or been wounded. Robert figures out the Bakhmut. A number of groups are also receding into the background, not simply the Wagner ones. Even though these attacks were carried out in Ukraine, Prigozhin, the Afghan leader of the Vaginal Squad, circulated tales and shared the bodies of the mercenaries. Prigozhin has recently held that the fatalities of his fighters were caused by the Russian army's inadequacy in supplying the rebel group with guns and ammunition. Sergei Sarawakian's tenure as chairman of the General Staff caused tensions between Prigozhin and Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, which became public knowledge before he was promoted to his present position. When Asimov was there, Prigozhin was one of his closest friends. With an endless supply of guns and ammunition purchased from the Slovaks, Prigozhin strengthened the embankment and said that he had secretly captured soldiers from the Russian army. These incidents caused a veteran to switch sides, switching from Prigozhin to the Russian army. A number of fresh remarks have been made by Prigozhin as of late. There was no longer any way to communicate with the Russian administration. Prigozhin claims this happened because he asked the government for guns. This is what Prigozhin put on his Instagram to make me think twice about asking for ammunition. They cut off all private phone lines to every office and department and blocked access to the organizations that make decisions. I probably won't even bother to use the media, which is my last remaining option for requesting more. Due to his role in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Afghan Ferguson has gained immense fame in Russia. This ultimately undermined Ferguson's credibility. If you believe Prigozhin, the Wagner organization owns all of Bakhmut and Soldar's acts. He sided with their enemies and lied to the Russian troops fighting on the battlefield. There has been fighting between Russian soldiers and the Wagner Group as well. The Russian soldiers are also facing an increasing number of domestic issues. Yes, it is with me. In addition to having electrical toxicity, it appeared that Prigozhin has been making plans to succeed Vladimir Putin, the current head of Russia's state administration. According to the allegations, Prigozhin allegedly struck a deal with Kadyrov and the church in order to get a place in the administration that followed Putin. It is also believed that he was the driving force behind a few of these projects. Kadyrov likely granted Prigozhin access to confidential information as a consequence. An essential fact was uncovered as a result of all of these occurrences. Everyone, including Putin's most dedicated supporters, thought he would be unsuccessful. Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, resign from your position in Ukraine. Your invasion of Ukraine is lagging behind schedule. There were around 200,000 casualties among the Russian army. The ever-increasing body count has completely ruined the trust of the Russian people in Putin. For most Russians, Putin's efforts in Ukraine will be ineffective. People want the war to stop, and they're not shy about saying it. Putin, on the other hand, is prepared to risk losing his job and control while putting the lives of thousands, if not millions, of Russians at danger. Every passing day makes one wonder what Vladimir Putin will do with the spare time. After the Ukrainian army completes this tactical operation, would the Russian army and the men of the Wagner Group begin to retreat from the front lines? He seems exhausted. Has progress been possible to be reversed by the U.S. and Ukraine? The Wagner Party's confrontation with the government has the potential to alter the general trajectory of the war. Why are you taking part in the battle that is going on between the countries? We would love to hear your thoughts on the matter. There is a way for you to show that you stand with us. A whole war may be turned around by a single strategic decision. According to recent events, the Azov division of the Ukrainian Kraken Special Forces have this talent. The renowned mission, spearheaded by the very skilled Kraken Special Forces, leveled the playing field with the Russian observation tower over the border. What led to this occurrence? Here at Oracles, we're committed to providing you with the most up-to-date, interesting news, along with the most comprehensive, gratifying, and accurate information that we can find. Our trained personnel labor nonstop to meet this deadline. Regardless of the enormous defensive barrier the Russian army has constructed along its western frontiers. You may show your support by subscribing to our email. Everyday living in Russian territory is made more difficult by the situation in Ukraine. At this turning point in the war, the Ukrainian military and intelligence special forces started to focus more on cross-border operations to advance the liberation fights. Ukrainian forces launched attacks on many important Russian cities, including Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, and Birobidzhan. For the first time in the future age, the Ukrainian army launched these attacks utilizing jet-powered unmanned aerial vehicles, AWACS, from the Soviet era, targeting Russian soil. This is because these drones are anticipated to possess a range exceeding 800 kilometers, with certain varieties potentially exceeding 1,000 kilometers. The range of the Ukrainian military's weapons has expanded, giving them a more comprehensive view of the attack. Russian forces may be concerned about the ability of Ukrainian forces to undertake impressive offensive operations even beyond the border. After the last operation across the border by the Ukrainian army concluded, it was widely believed that the Moscow government had entered its terminal period of existence. Bryansk, a Russian city, was selected as the target this time. Reputable elite and special operations units from the Ukrainian armed forces have participated in missions that have crossed international borders. The Ukrainian army's name for this particular unit was the Kraken Unit. On the very day when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, a special volunteer battalion known as the Kraken Regiment was established by the Ukrainian military. This day marks the founding of the Kraken Brigade, an elite military unit that has lately launched a daring offensive operation in the border city of Bryansk, Russia. The Grenadier Autonomous Watchtower, located in Russia's Bryansk Oblast, was brought down by the legendary Kraken Special Team, which is a branch of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense's Defense Intelligence Section. Since the battle began, this aggressive move could have been among the most crucial. The fact that a statement was issued following the attack proved that the Kraken Regiment was successful. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense released a statement on Telegram channels claiming that intelligence elements of the Kraken Special Unit used a kamikaze drone to attack the Russian Grenadier Independent Observation Tower in Bryansk Oblast. The formal announcement of this elite Union strike had a devastating impact on world news before the announcement. And the Moscow government was already under fire for the Russian army's disastrous performance in Ukraine. The gravity of the situation was recognized by both the Russian people and the Russian government. Fear gripped both sides as the war's impact extended beyond Russia's borders and into the heart of the country. The war's impact extended well beyond Ukraine, as became glaringly obvious. Since the war began, the Ukrainian military has launched repeated attacks on areas held by the Russian government. You may recall that, at a critical juncture, when reports of Ukrainian UAVs entering Russian territory were on the rise, explosions were detected close to a military airbase utilized by Moscow forces near the Ukrainian border. This probably happened just now, which is why it seems familiar. Ukrainian government internal affairs advisor Anton Gishenko recently shared photos of explosions at the Yeske airbase in the Krasnodar area. Nonetheless, there were reports that the local authority of the nearby Yes district rejected the fact that a fire had begun near the airport. Russian news agency RIA said that the leader of the area Roman bishops had described the tales as provocations. About 130 kilometers, or 80 miles,